This is the Canon AE-1 program. This camera is as iconic as it probably gets. This and its older brother, the Canon AE-1, are pretty much synonymous with 35mm photography. If you haven't heard of this camera, well, the chances are that you've actually have heard this camera. Listen to this. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because it's the shutter that Apple chose when designing their camera for iOS. So the best-selling camera in the world, the iPhone, has the same shutter, at least the sound, that this camera does. In 1979, Canon released the AE-1. This was the first amateur entry-level camera with auto exposure. That proved to be really important because having a dedicated microcomputer inside the camera minimized the amount of parts needed for the camera. This streamlined the manufacturing and was able to get the price down for people that wanted to get into photography that weren't necessarily professionals. A couple of years later, they released the A1, which had aperture priority, shutter priority, and a full automatic program mode. This was aimed at a consumer that wanted to spend a little more and kind of be semi-professional. It released on the market at 89,000 yen, which was a step higher than the AE-1 was. A couple years later, Canon realizes their AE-1 is kind of, although it's selling well, there's ways that it can be improved on with technology changing so rapidly, so they designed this camera, the AE-1 program. The AE-1 program introduces the program mode found in the A1, which is a fully automatic exposure. That means you turn your lens to A and your shutter speed to program, and it takes care of the rest. All you gotta do is focus. The other automatic setting is shutter priority. Canon was focused on the sports market and had a bunch of commercials with famous athletes and stuff. Kind of weird because, you know, athletes are playing the game. They're not really taking pictures while they're doing their sport, but it worked for Canon. While Nikon had dominated the professional market with the F3, Canon was hitting the mass market with these lesser built cameras, but were still excellent quality. To this day, if you're getting into 35mm photography, this is the camera that people point you to. And I'm going to talk about my experience with it. This is also my first 35mm SLR camera. I got this at an absolute bargain for $40 Canadian, but nowadays they go for more around 100, 150 online. So I'll talk about some of the pros and cons and a lot of the reasons why this camera is absolutely iconic. So let's take a look at the camera now. So here it is in person, the Canon AE-1. You can already see right away the kind of design elements that were carried over from the A1. Right away you see the grip and the change in the viewfinder prism design. The grip is actually interchangeable with the A1. The grip is nice to use. I found it helpful when you're kind of carrying the camera. It's not like a DSLR grip, it's more like a just kind of a little extra something for your hand to hold on to. Over here you got the exposure preview. I found that this was not entirely useful most of the time. On this particular camera, it's kind of hit or miss as to when it works. Here you have your flash sync cable, your exposure lock button. So if you're metering for like the shadows, you can bring the camera in close, hit this button, hold it down, and it'll hold that exposure setting. Over here on the top you have your mode switch. Here's self-timer, lock, and on. The lock is nice because even if the camera is loaded, the shutter won't fire accidentally. The film advance is nice and smooth. It is made out of plastic, but I haven't had any problems with that. Here is your shutter speed dial. It ranges from bulb 2 seconds to 1/1000th of a second, and program mode, of course. Hot shoe mount. The ISO dial. Hold down this button while you rotate this to select your ISO. This was a improvement from the past camera. The AE-1, the old one, you'd have to pull up a knob and then turn it. A lot of people had problems with that. It's not a big deal to me. Here's the battery check. You hold this down and it'll beep. Oh, as long as it's not in lock. Yeah, there you go. Film rewind. It is a little flimsy. It's all plastic. This camera's entirely plastic. This pulls up like this. Opens up like that. You got a cloth shutter in there. You can, here, let's look at the film advance as it moves. There you go. Just like that. Close it back up. Here's where you put your film. The film release. In here are the connectors for the motor drive, if that's something that you're interested in. This film release is actually really useful for double exposures. This camera doesn't have like an official double exposure setting, but if you hold this down and make sure your film's nice and tight, you can advance it and it'll stay on the same frame. So to get to the selling point of this camera, the program mode, you have to make sure your lens is also in automatic here. So you just do that by holding down this little button, moving it like this. The camera will do all the exposure settings for you, shutter speed and aperture. If you just want a shutter priority mode, you leave the lens in A and you move the shutter speed dial. The camera handles really nicely. Viewfinder is nice and bright. A little qualm I have with this camera is that the viewfinder, the split prism isn't too accurate, especially at really thin depths of fields. I found that if I'm taking like a full body portrait, it's really, really easy to miss focus, even though it looks perfect inside the viewfinder. So that's something to look out for. This camera is entirely electronically controlled, which for some people is a major deal breaker. It runs off this kind of weird 4LR44 battery. It has like a 6-volt, it's kind of about this big. They're kind of harder to find. They're not readily available, but they are still made and still purchasable, so it's not a huge deal. It's just that they're a little bit expensive and inconvenient. So let's take a look in the viewfinder next. So here's a little view inside the viewfinder. It has a split prism in the middle. So to achieve focus, you line up your image in the middle until it looks in focus, so all the lines are straight, just like that blade of grass right there. So that would be an in-focused image. A nice feature that this camera has is an LED lit light meter. So the light meter will tell you what aperture it's gonna choose or what aperture it recommends. So as you change your shutter speed up at top, you'll see the camera indicating to you what aperture recommends for a proper exposure. Some people prefer a needle, kind of like the original, that indicates to you whether or not you're over or under exposed, and you decide the adjustments for yourself. But here, it's an intuitive process, and you can really tell what each setting does. As you lower your shutter speed, your aperture has to go up, and it's a good learning tool. When it goes into program mode, a little P lights up like that. And another nice bonus of the light meter indicating your aperture is that in theory you can use your shutter priority as an aperture priority. So what I mean by that is that if you have the lens in auto, you can select your aperture not by the ring but by what the viewfinder is telling you, and that's the way I mostly use this camera. So I guess the question is, what is the Canon AE-1 program's role in modern photography? And I think it's an option for beginners for sure, but it's not the only option. A lot of people get caught up on this camera, and I think there's definitely pros to going with another brand. For example, the Pentax K1000 is a all-mechanical camera. It was the standard student photography camera for so many years. Those cameras are still workhorses to this day. If you're looking for something that you could grow into, I don't think the Canon FD lens mount is exactly a great place to go for that. For example, it used to be that the lenses were super cheap because they're no longer compatible with modern cameras, but what's going on now is that all these mirrorless shooters are getting all these old Canon lenses, and the price is definitely going up on these lenses. I would suggest maybe looking at the Nikon world, maybe checking out the Nikon FE. It's a camera I own and I really enjoy. It also lets you have room to grow with the lens selection. All your old Nikon manual focus lenses will mount on just about any modern DSLR body, and if you do decide to go mirrorless, you can always adapt those as well. So, you know, it's a great little camera, all things considered, but don't feel like it's the end all and be all, because it was never really that. If you want to check out this camera in action, I do have a couple videos of me shooting it on the street. I recommend the Ilford XP2 video I made. That one is a great video, if I do say so myself. And I think that's about it.